The deals that were done to undo Palestinian chances of statehood. Who strong-armed whom to get the vote of the United Nations Security Council to go the way that Israel wanted? And why the rush to a vote by the Palestinians when a short wait may have helped? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm David Foster. Power over billions worldwide, not just the Palestinians, rests often with the 15 members of the United Nations Security Council. And so it proved again this week when the US didn't even have to use its veto to see a resolution backing a timetable for Palestinian statehood find its way to the waste paper basket. We'll be looking on this Inside Story at how specifically it was done in this case. We'll also ask whether there will ever be change, if change is needed, at the top of what is supposed to be the world's most important peacemaking body. That's after this report by Kristen Salumi.
Lève la main.
Just 8 votes, not enough for the Palestinians to claim majority support in the Security Council. The resolution would have set a 2017 deadline for an end to Israeli occupation. Australia and the United States, as expected, voted against.
Regrettably, instead of giving voice to the aspirations of both Palestinians and Israelis, this text addresses the concerns of only one side. It is deeply imbalanced and contains many elements that are not conducive to negotiations between the parties, including unconstructive deadlines that take no account of Israel's legitimate security concerns.
5 countries abstained, including the United Kingdom, which criticized the lack of negotiations on the text, but expressed support for much of the resolution's content. France and other supporters said it was time for the Security Council to do more.
Après plus de 25 ans de négociations,
after more than 25 years of negotiations, the international community must share the weight of these negotiations and bear its share of the political and historical responsibility.
The Palestinian ambassador said the council was failing his people.
Considering the unsustainable and precarious situation that now prevails and the need to act responsibly on behalf of our people to address their needs and national aspiration, the Palestinian leadership must now consider its next steps.
There are questions about the timing of the vote. The Jordanians had helped write the resolution and wanted more time to consult the Security Council. The vote went ahead, they say, at the Palestinians' insistence. The Palestinian leadership's options are limited here, with Israel's ally, the United States, on the Security Council. They never really expected the resolution to pass. What they had hoped for was 9 votes and a symbolic victory. They didn't even get that. Kristen Salumi, Al Jazeera, the United Nations.
As it happened, Nigeria may have held the key because with a now you see it, now you don't sleight of hand, the mandarins mandated by President Obama managed to fool the Palestinians until the very last moment that they would get Nigeria's vote. It abstained. Vote lost by the Palestinians.
We're being assaulted and our lands are being attacked every day. Who do we complain to? The UN Security Council's let us down. Where do we go?
We bring in our guest now for this Inside Story in Washington, D.C. Phyllis Bennis, a UN advisor on the Middle East and author of the book Understanding the Palestinian-Israeli Conflict, a primer. And from London, Daniel Levy, Director of the Middle East and North Africa Programme at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Welcome to you both. Phyllis Bennis, let me start with you. What sort of pressure does a country like the United States put on other countries to get what it wants? In this case, Nigeria. In another case, maybe another nation.
You know, there's a long history at the UN, what they call the Yemen precedent. It was something that happened back in 1990 when the U.S. was trying to gather Security Council support for invading Iraq in the first Gulf War. The only Arab country on the council was Yemen, and when Yemen voted no, no sooner had the ambassador taken down his hand that the U.S. ambassador was at his side saying, that will be the most expensive no vote you ever cast. And the remark was picked up on a UN mic and broadcast around the world. 3 days later, the U.S. cut its entire aid budget to Yemen. And it was widely viewed as a message not only to Yemen, which at the time few countries really cared about. But it was viewed as a message to every other country in the world: you cross us on something important to us and you will pay a price. Ever since then, people, experienced hands at the UN, have spoken of the Yemen precedent. This was one more incident, and it took a late-night, last-minute phone call directly from President Obama to Nigerian President Goodluck Jonathan to get the Nigerians to change their position from supporting the Palestinian resolution. After all, Nigeria had long ago recognized Palestine as a state, had diplomatic relations, etc., and instead abstaining and thus denying Palestine the 9 votes they had hoped for. Now, what they were threatened with or bribed with.
Oh, sorry. We'll talk about that in just a second if we can, Phyllis, because I saw Daniel shaking your head slightly when Phyllis said that John Kerry persuaded Goodluck Jonathan to go the way the US wanted.
No, President Obama.
Oh, it was Obama himself?
President Obama, not John Kerry.
Okay, well, I also knew that John Kerry called him, but so did Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister. And there'd been a bit of a charm offensive, had there not, over the preceding year or year and a half between Israel and African countries. Israel is getting its weapons to Nigeria. Nigeria needed to not upset Israel to keep this coming, Daniel. Is that right?
You'd have to ask President Goodluck Jonathan what the balance of considerations between America leaning on his country and him personally versus the Israelis. You're absolutely right, David, that Israel has gone on an offensive in parts of Africa, in East Africa. Israel has used a counter-terror narrative, has used the kinds of weapons that it is able, and the intel it is able, to help furnish to certain African countries. Undoubtedly, the American leaning and the American leverage was very important here too. I simply question how significant it would have been had Nigeria flipped one way or the other. America was going to veto this anyway. Your correspondent said the Palestinians were denied a symbolic victory at the United Nations. Really? In 2015 is what the Palestinians need right now, symbolic victories? Is that going to be a game changer? Is that somehow going to change the prospects for peace, the prospects for freedoms for Palestinians, for ending occupation? So I think one could focus on what happened with the Nigerian vote, but I suggest it wouldn't be the most smart place to focus.
Absolutely. We're going to look into that in a little bit more detail in the second half of the programme. I'm just trying to get an explanation for our viewers of the way that the Security Council, the highest echelons of diplomacy, or perhaps you might want to call it bribery, actually works. I managed to dig up from this Nigerian newspaper from September of last year, 2 Nigerians and an Israeli caught in South Africa for smuggling about US $10 million to buy arms. So there's a massive trade going on. The United States won't sell stuff to Nigeria, but Israel is, perhaps implicitly with the United States say so on the quiet. All of this is going on in the background, is it not?
Well, the Israeli Prime Minister was very proud when he appeared in front of the cameras in Israel after the UN vote, in asserting that he had had conversations with the Nigerian president and the Rwandan president. Both of those countries abstained, as you know. They didn't vote against the resolution with America, and with America's very courageous UN ambassador Sam Power. I'm saying that cynically. She had some credibility, I think, in certain circles before she became ambassador to the UN. I imagine she has very little of that left. But yes, Israel was happy that it could swing or help swing with the Americans the votes of these 2 African countries into the abstaining column. And this simply helped America avoid some kind of an embarrassment. You also have to ask the question of the Palestinians. What leverage did they assume they had to guarantee that that Nigerian vote would remain solid? Surely they expected pressure to be applied on Nigeria.
Which leads me back to you, Phyllis, and your suggestion. I cut you off short, I'm sorry about that, that there's bribery involved in this. Because a point I'd like to raise is Israel able to strong-arm the US in getting its continued support? And if so, how? Or is it just that the US needs Israel as its ally in an area of regional volatility? Who's feeding off whom here?
It's both. I think that depending on who you ask in Washington, you will get different answers about who's the dog and who's the tail at any given moment. The reality is that the intersection of interests that are military and corporate driven. These are economic interests, they're military interests, they're not the interests of the people of the United States. But there has been enough history of the strategic relationship between the U.S. and Israel, the so-called special relationship that goes back to the '67 war, not before that, but it was at that time, and starting in a relationship between the Pentagon and the Israel Defense Forces, that created this so-called special relationship that we now see carried out both at the strategic level and at the political level, where the pro-Israel lobbies, the traditional Jewish organizations and the newer Christian pro-Israel organizations, both play a very powerful role financially in backing the candidates of many members of Congress. So you have this intersection of political and strategic interests that put them all on the same side. Israel doesn't have to strong-arm the U.S. into it. It's the assumed position of the United States, which is only now just barely beginning to change. There's been a massive change in the public discourse on this question, where massively people across the United States do not any longer believe that U.S. and Israeli interests are the same. It has yet to penetrate to the Washington bubble. That's only just barely beginning. And in this instance, we saw an indication that it was both Israel and the United States bringing pressure to bear on particularly the African countries that are deemed more vulnerable. They're vulnerable to bribes, whether it's in the form of access to arms that might have been denied because of human rights violations. Israel traditionally plays that role for the United States, providing arms to countries that the U.S. won't any longer arm because of those kinds of violations. It can be in offering better oil prices, for example, from Nigeria, perhaps, a major oil producer. It can be in the form of trade agreements like AGOA, the Africa Growth and Opportunities Act. We don't know yet, we may hear later, that the U.S. used AGOA and Nigeria's role within it as part of that pressure. That's been a traditional means of bringing pressure to bear on African countries. So there's a host of instruments available to both the United States and Israel to both pressure and bribe
Phyllis,
those governments.
I'm going to go to Daniel now. And Daniel, I do promise to get on to the specific problems of the Middle East in just a moment. But in the broader sense, it might be interesting to our viewers to know that actually more vetoes have been cast by Russia, the former Soviet Union, than by the United States, not in recent times. But I'm wondering about other countries with intractable problems. An example being Ukraine, Crimea, and the Russian veto early in 2014. Does there need to be change at the UN to help the underdog, if you like?
And of course, you could add Syria and other issues to your list, David, and rightly so. When you suggest does there need to be more help for the underdog, why would the countries that have the power to prevent that want to divest themselves of that power? So I think one has to understand that the UN can play an important role. The UN does play an important role. In many instances, the agencies of the UN can play an important role. But if you have an inability to reform the current structure, and if you have an unwillingness on the part of the veto-holding countries to, if you like, play by the rules that go beyond their narrow national or economic or as they define them, security self-interests, then of course the UN is going to become, at certain given moments, sometimes very important moments for conflicts or for global peace, the UN is going to become paralyzed and unable to act. On the Israeli-Palestinian issue, of course, it has been paralyzed for many years.
And we are getting there.
Why the Palestinians would go there.
We are getting there right now. Daniel, Phyllis, for now, thank you very much indeed. Back with you in just a moment. The question is, what next? Well, the Palestinian Authority President, Mahmoud Abbas, has moved rapidly to sign what is called the Rome Statute. Imtiaz Tayyab in Ramallah in the occupied West Bank explains.
This, of course, is very significant because it effectively starts the Palestinians down the road towards joining the International Criminal Court. That is something that the Palestinians have been suggesting for years now that they would do. Now we are the closest they've ever been to doing just that. And predictably, the Israelis are very angry at it. In fact, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu saying, quote, "The Palestinians have more to fear from the ICC than the Israelis do." Now, this, of course, is very significant. The ICC ICC would effectively allow the Palestinians to press war crime charges against the Israelis. The Israeli Prime Minister saying effectively that they would do the same to the Palestinians. So this, of course, as we've been saying, is a very bold move by the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas. But already we're hearing an awful lot of anger coming from the Israelis.
I'd like to bring in Nadim Shahidi, now Associate Fellow at Chatham House, a Middle East specialist, joining us from Beirut. Mr. Shahidi, what good would joining the International Criminal Court do for the Palestinians if that became the case, when we know that Israel could obfuscate for years, particularly with its own inquiry into alleged war crimes, and it might get nowhere in terms of a prosecution against Israel?
Yes, I mean, that is a possibility, and I think that the PA or the PLO in this case is very well aware of that and is pushing the argument to its extreme, because the bottom line is an internal question within Palestinian society and within Arab society as a whole, even here in Lebanon. The question is whether you can achieve any results through negotiations and through diplomacy and through international legal instruments like the United Nations Security Council or other UN agencies.
And that is the question. Does it do any good? Does it do any good?
Yeah, that is the question. But I mean, the alternative to that is the argument within these societies that the only answer is through resistance operations and through violence. And that was the key issue in the last Gaza war, where Hamas claimed victory by saying that it has achieved through resistance more than the PLO has achieved through 20 years of negotiations. So I think that's the central question. And the PLO has, in a way, announced what its path. It has said that it's going to go to the Security Council. If it fails, it will go to the ICC. And it has already announced also that if it fails, if everything else fails, then it will dissolve itself, the PNA will dissolve itself, and Israel will then have to bear the consequences of having a real occupation under its hand and bearing the cost of the occupation. At the moment, Israel has it good in two ways, in the sense that it has the occupation and the international community is paying for it.
Phyllis Bennis, let me come back to you. We have the question here of Palestinian, or the PLO perhaps applying to join the International Criminal Court. But we've got an institution here that's cost so far in the last 12 or so years $1 billion. It's had 2 convictions. It's had one recently fall apart against the first head of state. That was Uhuru Kenyatta. This is just a waste of time in many ways, isn't it? Because it's not going to see the result that the Palestinians would like.
Well, I don't think we can say that yet. I think that the International Criminal Court is a very weak instrument. It was created that way mostly because of U.S. pressure, despite the fact that the U.S. at the Rome negotiations in 1999, I was there for those negotiations, in 1995, the U.S. Pressured enormously to weaken the jurisdiction and enforcement capacity of the court, implying that if it was just a little weaker, it would join. And then, of course, at the end of the day, it didn't join anyway, but left the court significantly weakened. That is not something that's going to be there forever. The court will get stronger over time. This has been a 20-year effort to create an international jurisdiction over war crimes that never existed before. Does it work well? Not yet. Is it politicized? Yes, it is. Too much. The U.S. and its allies have way too much power over it. But I think that we have to look down the road. The other question, as Nadim said, for the Palestinians, what is the alternative? You know, the New York Times this morning in their editorial said the Palestinians' desperation move. But the Times doesn't propose what the Palestinians should do with the failure of 25 years of U.S.-led diplomacy. One thing that was not mentioned here, we're not just facing the situation where the choice is either limited to the United Nations or a return to armed struggle. There is the very important global mobilization, the movement known as BDS, Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions, which is an initiative led by Palestinian civil society, not by Palestinian authorities, whether the PA or the PLO, and is having an enormous impact in changing the power relations and weakening the legitimacy of Israel's occupation and apartheid. That's having probably more impact.
As we near the end of this inside story, got time for a couple more questions. Daniel, to you first of all. Let's go back to the Security Council and the issue of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The United States has said it probably wouldn't veto some of the resolutions if certain conditions were met. It's called the Negroponte Doctrine. A couple of the points in it. There has to be a condemnation by name of the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade, Islamic Jihad and Hamas, etc., etc. Strong and explicit condemnation of all terrorism. Why is that not acceptable to the United States or to the countries that put forward resolutions such as the one we've just seen, the Palestinian resolution? Why is it not acceptable to have that in there to get the resolution attacking Israel that they appear to want?
That's incredibly naive to imagine that that's all it would take to get the non-use of an American veto, and I don't think there's been any serious suggestion on the part of the Americans. It goes back to what Phyllis explained earlier, and it goes back to why would you go to the UN, which is a place where the Security Council, which is a place where Israel is not particularly vulnerable. Nadeem and Phyllis raised very important points here, which is that what America is doing by calling this step of using international law, of going to the UN, escalatory by the Palestinians, is antithetical to peace and probably to American interests. It tells the Palestinians, as Nadeem suggested, that your option is either to sit down, shut up and enjoy being occupied and having no rights, or to pursue armed resistance, because the options of diplomacy and international law are closed to you. And it raises the question, why would the Palestinians go to the UN or even go to the ICC? Is it to get a victory at the UN or the ICC, or is this an acknowledgement that the Palestinians might need a strategy that builds leverage and ends the cost-free occupation? If that's the strategy, you have to ask, where is that leverage effective and where is it available? And Phyllis just suggested where it is effective and where it is available, but it is a path that the Palestinian leadership has chosen not to pursue.
Apologies for my naivety, Daniel. I'm asking the question on behalf of some people who might like to hear your response, and I'm glad you did respond that way. Nadeem, the question I asked before I just introduced you was where does it go from here? Can you wrap up this programme by giving us some idea where you think it might proceed to?
Yes, I think that what the Palestinian Authority is doing now is in a way negative, because it is alienating the Israelis, and it is not going to lead to a negotiated solution using these tactics. But what is needed now is an initiative to bring things back on track and reverse the process, i.e. recognize the Palestinian state in the United Nations Security Council and negotiate the consequences of that before the vote, so that there will not be any negative moves from either side when the vote happens. So what I'm saying is that the peace process in the last 25 years has led to mountains of documents on all the problems, and they have not reached a final status solution. So the way to do it now is to recognize the state first, and then you will have two states who will have problems like all states have that are neighbors. They will have.
And a quick thought before we wrap up, just as short as you can on this one, Nadeem, if you can. Is the Security Council, is the UN going to be part of the solution that you've just suggested or part of the problem? Quick as you can, I'm sorry for that.
Well, the Security Council at the moment is part of a global problem that needs to be resolved, and this is felt in every context, including the Syrian context and Ukraine. So what is needed is to, if this fails, then we have a much more serious global crisis on our hands, where there is no instrument to resolve international conflicts. And the Security Council's objective of maintaining global peace will have failed.
Thank you, each one of you. Thanks to Phyllis Bennis in Washington, D.C., Daniel Levy in London, Nadeem Shahadi in Beirut. Do let us know your thoughts. Post your comments at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story or contact us on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. A final thought. If diplomacy and international bribery don't get you what you want, then perhaps smoke and mirrors will. From me, David Foster. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.